uh, basically refers to uh, things that are real, that are true, that actually exist in your view. Oh, there's a philosopher Natalie. So, things that you claim are true, objectively true, but are not physical, and therefore cannot be physically proved. So, to give an example of something which cannot be physically proved, justice, equality. Um, Yesterday, or the fact that when you woke up this morning, you went from a dream into the real world. As, of course, the other possibility is, although I wouldn't bet on it, is that you went from the real world to a dream. And that when you were sleeping, you were in the real world, and now you're dreaming. Again, I don't plan to organize my life around that principle, but you can't empirically prove it's not true because your dream is not empirically available. Another thing you can't prove as an objective truth is beauty or love. You can't say that you really love someone or free will. And we could go through all these things and very easily show that these things are beyond empirical evidence. For example, I'll give one example. You could say a man could say, "I love my wife," or the wife could say, "I love my children." But someone could say, "Well, no, because to say that you love someone indicates a type of free will, but actually, you're just neurologically programmed. You're just neurologically programmed to think that you are choosing to love someone or stay with someone. In fact, you don't have free will at all." Of course, if someone says there's no free will, then they don't really believe that, or they're not really saying that. It's just because if they have no free will, they didn't choose to say that, and they didn't choose to believe it. They're just neurologically programmed to say there's no free will. So rather than go on with more examples, I'll simply say that no one can live a real life as if nothing is real or true unless it's empirically proved. One very famous atheist philosopher, uh, John Searle from Berkeley, he's one of the most well-known atheistic or materialistic philosophers in the last few generations. And he said the problem with saying that there's no free will is that you can't actually live your life that way. You can't actually live your life that way because if you go to a restaurant and the waiter comes and expects you to order, like if you can't sit at that table all day if you don't order. And if you tell the waiter, well, I'm just waiting for my neurology to say what it wants, or not even what it wants, just to say something. In other words, you can't live your real life that way. But apart from the fact that no one can actually live their life as if there are only physical facts and not metaphysical facts, um, there are logical problems. And this logical problem was pointed out a very long time ago, almost a century ago, but the reason scientists don't know that is because they no longer study philosophy. And that's a topic I'll get to next, that the disaster of the science community thinking that it was epistemically autonomous and self-sufficient and didn't need to make anything like logical sense. But in the 1920s, there arose a movement led by very prominent scientists and then kind of endorsed by genuflecting philosophers, which was called logical positivism. And before that, there was the idea that you can't really say something which is important, that's really objectively important, unless you give empirical proof. You're just giving your opinion. Like you can say, only Jesus saves, or you can say that your present condition is a result of past karma. But those statements are not that important because they can't be empirically proved. Logical positivism took that a step further and actually said that if you make a statement which can't be empirically proved, the statement is actually meaningless. You didn't really, it's almost like a baby babbling. You really didn't say anything which is even intelligible. And that was logical positivism. And someone has their microphone on.
Yeah, I would request the participants to just check once again. The mic should be on mute. Maybe let me switch up the host control.
Okay, you can hear me, I suppose. So, so philosophers, including philosophers that had once endorsed it, like A.J. Ayer, realized that if only empirically proved statements are meaningful, there's a problem because you cannot empirically prove that only empirically proved statements are meaningful. So if it's a statement which, if it's true, it's not true. And if you have a statement which, if it's true, is not true, is basically what we would call nonsense. In other words, it's just an absurd meaning. It's interesting because in the Puranas, like Bhagavatam and Mahabharata, which is Itihasa, other literature, you have these cases where an asura or a demon will throw a weapon, say at Krishna, and because the weapon cannot harm Krishna, the weapon comes back and kills the person that launched it. So it's interesting how logical positivism, which claimed that statements not empirically proved are meaningless, it turned out that statement was meaningless. So it basically self-destructed. But so why do some scientists still claim that, even though it's philosophically nonsense and logically nonsense? And that is because this last point, then I want to get to the point of spiritual science, so that no one wants their money back, because that's how it was advertised. So if you look at the 1800s, for most of the 1800s, and even you could say the 1700s, or perhaps the 1600s, because that way we include Newton and Copernicus and Kepler and all those people. It was understood that, or how should I put it, the basis of science was a metaphysical assumption. And this metaphysical assumption sort of came from, I don't know what you'd call it, sort of a type of intellectually paganized Christian theology. And because in the pagan world, one of the most popular pagan philosophies, by pagan, I mean actually the kind of reasonable people in the Greco-Roman world, there was a school called the School of Stoicism, from the word stoa, which means a porch, because Greece has nice Mediterranean weather, so people would hang out and open their porches and philosophize. Anyway, so the Stoic philosophy was very influential for about 600 years. 600 years, that's a long time. And a lot of Stoic philosophy was centered on the concept of logos. And this is the same Greek word logos from which we get the word logic and all of the ologies of academia, biology, physiology, geology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only one they lost, much to their dismay, is astrology. They actually lost that one. And the astronomers are still kind of unhappy about that. But anyway, so the word logos, this Greek word logos meant, as you can imagine, logic, reason, just giving a reasonable, intelligent explanation of something. And so they believed that the logos, this logos, why are we even capable of being logical? How is it that we even have the power to reason? And their answer to that was that because ultimately there is a divine logos, which is the mind of God. And it's very interesting. They conceived of God not so much as a vengeful, jealous, super uptight person that throws people into lakes of fire if they make even subtle theological mistakes about him. But they conceived of God as this infinitely rational being. And because God creates the world, therefore the world is constructed, is structured in a logical way. So there is a logos of nature because nature is a creation. And because we are also creations of God, we also have within us that same power, the same power of being reasonable. And so the logos within us can connect with the logos of nature. And what does that give you? It gives you science. And also, we can connect to God because both God and ourselves are reasonable and intelligent. And so that idea that the logos, the divine logos, it pervades nature, and that we have that same logos in ourselves since we are also creatures. Therefore, there can be such a thing as science, as empirical science. Because if the world was completely erratic, let's say, for example, like today it's Sunday, so objects, fall down toward their source of gravity, but tomorrow, Monday, they're going to go sideways. And why they go sideways on Monday, there's no reason for it. They just do. This reminds me of the ontologies of primitive societies. But anyway, that's another topic. So, so you imagine a world in which there were not laws of nature. Everything was just completely erratic and random. Things were just crazy. You'd never know about it because in such a world you would never, you couldn't have a super scientific logical body. So um, so that's what inspired the scientific revolution. It was inspired, to give one more simple example, Copernicus, who sort of claimed by atheistic scientists, but the Copernican revolution was really a revolution based on taking both science and God very seriously. That was actually because Copernicus, as many learned Christians were, going all the way back to the fourth century AD and earlier, many intellectual, educated Christians were also Platonists. They also had a lot of faith in Plato's philosophy because it was compatible with basic Christianity and it was really smart. And so Copernicus was a Christian Platonist. Christian Platonist. And in Plato, the sun is a symbol of God because the sun is a source of light. That's God. And because it's a source of light, it enables vision. And vision has always been a metaphor for knowledge in every civilization, including the Vedic. In fact, in Bhagavad-gita, Krishna says that that if you accept Krishna, you get adityavat jnanam, knowledge which is like the sun. So this is an ancient and ubiquitous metaphor, knowledge, light, the sun. And so Copernicus thought, well, uh, Plato says that the sun is a source of light and therefore it represents God, which is also in the Brahma Samhita, by the way, Yat Chakshuresha Savita Sakala Grahanam Raja, that the sun is the eye of God. Yat Chakshur Esha Savita. So if the sun represents God, why not put God in the center of the solar system? And he thought, well, if you do that, the numbers work. So that was the Copernican revolution was not a revolution of atheist science in opposition to church doctrine. it was actually the Copernican revolution was a revolution of religion and science working together in a uh, I'm not going to use the word synergistic because I don't know, somehow it's a cliche, but in a complementary way, in a complementary way. That's the Copernican revolution. So now let's get to the point. So if you claim that the empirical method is exclusively valid to get objective knowledge, you necessarily contradict yourself. And you cannot avoid that contradiction. And therefore, you are necessarily speaking nonsense. So, what about a spiritual science? What about a spiritual science? Well, if we want to think about a spiritual science, first of all, we have to know what the word science means. And we cannot define the word science in a way that predisposes our analysis irrationally or even self-contradictorily, is that a word, in a certain direction. So if we say that, and as we know, if we say that only the empirical method can form the basis of a real science, then that claim is not empirical. And so a statement which is self-contradictory cannot be a valid definition, unless in your definition you're trying to give an example of self-contradiction. If you're trying to define science, that definition will never work. If you're trying to define self-contradiction, it would be a good example to give. So, what would be a definition of science that is not self-contradictory? In a sense, and we have to answer that question before we can say, can there be a spiritual science? So I'm going to actually look in my somewhat mediocre Apple Computer Dictionary and type in the word science, which means, first of all, it says the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, and the testing of theories, blah, blah, blah. So that's one definition of science, and it's not a relevant definition for our purpose because it's too narrow. Okay, so here's another definition, which is still under number one. You know, the definitions are numbered in terms of, you could say, priority. And so we're still in the number one definition, but a subset of number one, which is more relevant to us, is a systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. A systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. And they give us an example, the science of criminology, which is interesting because criminology, you could say, is, it's sort of like sociology. I won't get into the argument, is it a subset of sociology? But it's not a hard science. In other words, if it was a hard science, even in that Spielberg, Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report, anyone know that movie? If you know that movie, say Hare Krishna. Anyway, but it was supposed to be a situation. Anyway, never mind that movie. But let's say, for example, social science advanced to the point. Social science became so advanced that they could predict who would commit a crime, when, and what crime. That will never happen for the simple reason that sociology and psychology, much to the, I guess, the frustration of some of these people, can never be a hard science. For the simple reason you can't have a hard science where one of the components in any interaction is free will. Because if you could have a hard science of free will, a deterministic hard science, then there could not be free will. So the only way you can have a hard science of free will is to say there's no such thing as free will, in which case you don't have a hard science of free will, because there's no such thing. So therefore, I'll repeat that statement. It is logically impossible. In other words, it's just like, I'll explain more what I mean by logically impossible. If you say John is a bachelor, then that can be empirically investigated. He may claim to be a bachelor because he thinks it's good for his dating life, when in fact he has a wife at home. So he takes off his wedding ring when he goes out on dates. So therefore, you could empirically investigate whether John is actually a bachelor or not. But if you say John is a bachelor married to Susan, we don't have to investigate. You don't have to hire a private investigator. If you say John is a married bachelor, that is logically impossible. It's like saying that I drew a picture of a square circle. There's no such thing as a square circle. You don't have to investigate. If I say, for example, that in the backyard of the Bhakti-yoga Institute house, we have a blue unicorn that wandered in one day and we fed it, and now, it stayed. So now you may think that's extremely unlikely. You may think it's extremely unlikely that there's a blue unicorn, I mean, a living organic blue unicorn here in our backyard, but it's not logically impossible. The words blue and unicorn do not contradict themselves in the way square and circle contradict themselves, or the way married and bachelor contradict themselves. Therefore, it's not logically impossible, and something which is not logically impossible, but someone claims is true, has to be investigated. And you can investigate empirically. Then you have the problem of the empirical method, that you can never have absolute certainty, because maybe, for example, you dropped a ball and it fell down and not up, and everything's ever dropped in known human history went down and not up, but the laws of nature could change. So if something is logically impossible, that means it's really impossible. And that impossibility can never be remedied by any type of empirical evidence. There's no kind of empirical evidence that can show that a square can be a circle. So therefore, getting back to the point of a spiritual science, what would it mean? And so we need a more universal definition of science. And if we look in the dictionary, still under the number one definition, systematically organized. Okay, we check that box, because if we look at Bhagavad-gita, if we look in general, let's say at our Vaishnav, you could call it philosophical theology, it is systematically organized. It is a body of knowledge. It is on a particular subject. And so, just according to the definition of science in the dictionary, you can have a spiritual science. But let's say we raise the bar here and we say, okay, but even though you can have a spiritual science according to that definition, what about a spiritual science where you can actually make predictions and they come true? Or a spiritual science where you can repeat results, because obviously if you can predict a causal chain, then it can happen over and over again. You just have to arrange so that you have the same causality. And Krishna, it's interesting, in the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna says he talks about causality, actually, quite a bit. And without going into all of his statements on causality, but so if we want to raise the bar and make it, a little more stringent, rigorous for something to qualify as a science, we can say, well, we should be able to repeat those results over and over again and show that that when we created a sufficiently identical, or not absolutely identical, but sufficiently identical causal context so that we can attribute the results to a particular cause. For example, I could say that my yard only gets wet when it rains, and so then it rains and the ground's wet. But then someone could take a hose and water the lawn, and I could say, oh, and so they could say, well, no, the lawn is wet and it didn't rain. So you'd have to be more precise and say, let's say the whole city gets wet only when it rains, like everybody's lawn and everybody's driveway and all the streets and all the buildings, everything gets wet only when it rains. And you'd have trouble, replicating that with garden hoses. So in the case of bhakti yoga, what kind of predictable results are there? And Krishna gives many of them in the Bhagavad-gita. Krishna gives many results. He says that uh, those who surrender unto me, I will take care of them. I will protect them. Or that there will be certain epistemic results, that if you devote yourself to Krishna, you will become aware of certain things. You will increase your understanding of life, and you will see things you hadn't seen before. You will understand things. And eventually you will come to Krishna. So there's Krishna, a lot of the Bhagavad Gita and other texts like the Bhagavatam talk about causes and effects. If you do this, you get that, and sometimes in bad ways. For example, if you perform demonic or sinful activities, you'll get different results, which include misery, suffering, and other things. And so the very fact that there is a the very fact that there is a huge historical community, and by historical I mean here that it continues through time, there is a huge historical community of Vaishnavas. And so if there was nothing like a spiritual science, how could that be the case? It's very interesting because what atheists will say, and this is I'm sure you've heard this, and they think it's a good argument. It's actually a bad argument. And what is it? Wait, it just slipped my mind that, they'll say that the fact that a very strong majority, an overwhelming majority of all the human beings who ever lived on this planet believed in something supernatural in the literal sense, there's something beyond the empirical, something which is spiritual or mystical, just something beyond the natural, supernatural. And almost in all cases, some kind of god, goddess, or monotheistic god or impersonal god or something. Now, they'll reply to this that doesn't prove anything. Have any of you ever heard this? But now there's a problem with their reply. They'll say that and then sort of go home thinking that they gave a real blockbuster answer. But the problem is they didn't. The problem is they went home too early. It's like a basketball game where you think you won and you go back to the locker room, but what you didn't see, there are actually 3 minutes left in the game. So the other team just stands there next to the basket, dunking the ball over and over again until they win. So you better be sure the game is actually over before you go back to the locker room. Now, if we say that the testimony, this is actually in, let's say, philosophical epistemology, this is a specific type of evidence called evidence from authority or human testimony. For example, if you're on a commercial flight and the captain comes on and says, we're headed towards some real turbulence, so you have to put on your seatbelt. And let's say if you don't put on your seatbelt, you're really going to be at risk of injury. So for the people on the flight, at least all the ones who are sane, that constitutes evidence. The fact that the captain came on and said that constitutes evidence for their practical decisions. And in fact, that's basically what always happens. You do actually hit the turbulence. Or, for example, I had a certain medical thing, and I went to these doctors and finally found a doctor who was really good and figured it out. And then last year in Gainesville, I had surgery that completely fixed the problem. And so I took that surgeon who had an excellent reputation. I took his statements as authoritative, and then my experience confirmed that he was actually a valid authority. So if we say that human testimony doesn't prove anything, what about the human testimony that there's really an objective physical world outside our minds? That's human testimony. I mean, someone somewhere in the world is a solipsist. In other words, they don't believe that. They believe that because actually, even today, what do they call it? Virtual realities. I mean, I remember years ago, for some reason, I found myself at Universal Studios in Los Angeles. Uh, and I went on this ride completely against my will. I was dragged onto this ride because I was a Hare Krishna. So against my will, I was dragged onto this ride. And it was a rocket to some planet or something. And what I found interesting is the other people on the ride, they were mostly adults and they looked like they were, reasonably educated people. And yet the technology overcame their ability to perceive reality. Because at one point, the digital technology showed you're about to crash onto some planet. And basically, half the people on the ride were sort of ducking. And so that means, I mean, nowadays we have technology that can exceed our ability to figure out if something's real or not, which is a problem, as we know, for what do they call it, deep fakes and everything. But okay, I want to talk about a deep fake, which comes from Krishna. And I'm going to open up the Gita. And you could say it problematizes human testimony. And so we'll see what Krishna says and whether there is some way to deproblematize what Krishna says. Uh, let's see. The verses begin in, let's see. Okay, 721. Actually, 720 of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna says that kamais taistar hritajnana prapadyante devata, that people who are whose knowledge has been stolen by various material desires, prapadyante, they approach or they surrender to other deities. That's what Krishna says. Prapadyante anya devata. Tang tang niyamam astaya. And practicing the various regulations for the worship of those other devatas or people. Devata literally means someone that's standing in as God. Or it doesn't mean a devata. Deva means God. Devata sort of means taking the position of God. And so some people legitimately take the position of God because they are God. And then you get cases where, well, not some people actually, God. If God says I'm God, that's, he's a devata, but he's also deva. Or, for example, let's say a guru, where we say a guru takes, represents God. So, but that's a representation. So if you use the term guru devata, it just means a guru who's, representing God. But then what about if someone just gets it wrong? What if someone thinks that somebody is God, but they're actually not God, and they're actually claiming to be God? They're not claiming to represent God, they're claiming to be God, but that person is not God. So what about that? Or what about someone that doesn't claim to be God, but you think that person is God? I mean, Prabhupada kept saying all the time, I'm not God. I'm a servant of God, but some people said Prabhupada's God. That Prabhupada, of course, kicked them out of ISKCON, but some people could say, so what about those people? So Krishna goes on to say, Jo, Jo, Jiang, Jiang, that whoever uh, devotes themselves to whatever form or manifestation which they think is God, and they do it with faith. They actually, uh, with faith, they wish to worship someone as God. Then Krishna says, Tasya Tasya Chalang Shadham. In every case, I give them literally unmoving faith. I arrange for them unmoving faith. So if, let's say if it's the case that Jesus of Nazareth was a representative of God. Let's say he actually represented God, but then for various historical reasons, some people began to think, no, he is God. And then you get basically the polytheism of the Trinity. That's another topic. So, what happens to or people who think that Joe the plumber is God, or people that think whatever this is God, that's God. In India, you need a whole encyclopedia to keep track of all of everyone that's God. It'd be a multi-volume work. So what about that? So Krishna says that whoever has faith in whatever form and worships someone as that, Krishna says in every case, I give them unmoving faith. I give them that, I fix their faith in that. So is Krishna deceiving them? Why is Krishna doing that? But let's see what then Krishna goes on to say that he, that person, taya shraddhaya yuktas, endowed with that faith which I gave them or I fixed for them, the person begins their worship. Tasya aradhanam ihate. They begin their worship and labate chatata, come on, and they get their wishes. They actually get their wishes, but in fact, mayaiva bhitan hitan, that all those wishes are bestowed by me alone. So here you have a situation where, because of the variety of human psychologies, people think that something is God, or even if they don't think it's God, they just think, okay, I'm going to worship that because I'll get a lot of rewards that I want. So you don't even have to have like some serious theological commitment. It can just be that I think that, I mean, in India and in the West and everywhere, some people go and worship because they think they'll get money or they'll get power. And that's very common also. And then they get it. So how can we know that Krishna is actually the supreme Lord if Krishna himself makes people's faith strong in different forms that are not God? So are we actually fighting against Krishna? So to get the answer to that question, uh, here's my PayPal account. You will have to make I'm just kidding. That was a joke. So, and so there, I would say you have to get into the spiritual science. You have to get into the spiritual science. And Rupa Goswami gives an example of that uh, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Nectar Devotion, where Rupa Goswami gives an example of how you can reason in the face of all these competing claims about what God is. How can you actually adjudicate this? How can you sort this out? And so Rupa Goswami gives an example. He explains that, and he's obviously talking about India at his time, and to some extent, even today in India, not so much in other places, that some people say Shiva's God, and some people, or even among the Vaishnavas, some people say that the original form of God is Narayan or Vishnu, and then we say is Krishna. And so if Krishna is making everybody's faith strong, how do you figure this out? And at that point, what Rupa Goswami shows by example is you figure this out by philosophy. By philosophy. And what's very interesting about what Rupa Goswami does, and maybe this will be like the last point, but what's very interesting about what he does is that he uses a form of the ontological proof for God's existence, an argument given actually several centuries before Rupa Goswami by Anselm, a leader of the Catholic Church. Well, at a time when there was only a Catholic Church, they didn't No, actually, at that time, actually about the time Protestants broke away. So anyway, uh, so Anselm, I'll tell you when he lived. No, whoops. I clicked on St. Anselm and I got a bar called St. Anselm. So rather than give you the menu of that bar, I'll try again. Uh, okay. Okay, now I got he was actually he lived in the he died in 1109. He died in 1109, so he was born in 1033. So he was about roughly 470 years before Rupa Goswami or something like that. But he gave the argument that God is that being than whom no greater being can be conceived. And his argument, which is it's kind of a philosophical trick, but atheists are still kind of like struggling with it. He said that if you say that God doesn't exist, I can imagine a greater God, namely a God who does exist. And I won't go into all the, there's been literally like almost 1,000 years of philosophical fighting over this. But let's say, for example, rather than take it as a proof that God exists, let's just take it as a valid claim that if you believe that God exists, then this is a valid way to try to understand who is God. So the idea is basically, I mean, underlying this argument is the assumption that since God is infinitely great, the greatest conception of God is closest to the truth. And so my reply to Anselm, if we can anyone here channel Anselm? No? Actually, if we have some Brazilian devotees, they can probably channel spirits. But anyway, so so I would say to Anselm that I can very easily imagine a greater God than one. We can easily imagine a greater God than one who tortures people forever, doesn't give them second chances. Like take the notion, for example, that you only have one life. That was an idea pushed, by the way, by Augustine, and for no good reason. I guess he wanted maximum pressure on recalcitrant, people that weren't taken to Christianity. Like, let's do maximum pressure. You only have this one life. But the problem with that is it contradicts the notion that God is infinitely merciful. And as we know, one life, I mean, those of us who have lived long enough know that it's not like a really long time, one life. I mean, think of how old you are now and think of all the things you want to do or hope to do, and most of the things on the list you haven't done yet. So one life is really not very long. And there's no good reason why an all-merciful God would not just give you unlimited opportunities. I mean, imagine a father and mother who tell their child you have one chance to behave properly, and if you don't, we're going to torture you forever. I mean, not only is that not the greatest conception of God, it's one of the worst possible conceptions. It's like almost infinitely wrong. And so therefore, we can imagine a better conception of God, namely one who's actually all merciful. And Rupa Goswami, he wasn't talking about that question because they couldn't imagine something as absurd as eternal hell based on performance in one life, which is just, I mean, they couldn't even imagine something that absurd in India at the time. So Rupa Goswami says that some people worship Shiva, some people worship Narayan. But if we study the qualities of all these manifestations of divinity, which they all are, we find that Krishna has by far the greatest number of divine qualities. And therefore, Krishna is God. So again, God is infinitely great. So the greatest conception is most accurate. So the point I was making is that since Krishna himself gives people faith, because otherwise he would be interfering with their free will. So Krishna lets you choose whatever you want, and it will enable you to actually carry through with your choice, but then you have to experience the result and see how happy it makes you and see, And so ultimately, Krishna has the greatest number of divine qualities. Therefore, that's the greatest conception of God, and therefore the most accurate conception of God. So even though Krishna, for the moment, makes someone's faith strong and some kind of really poor candidate to be the Supreme Lord, or simply somebody you just want to worship. Let's say you're not philosophically inclined, you're not theologically inclined, you don't really care who God is. You just, want to, somehow or other, if you're a guy, make sure that Mary Lou falls in love with you. Mary Lou, a woman's name's surprisingly not as popular as it once was. So, um, so a lot of people who begin to worship this or that are not seriously interested in finding the highest absolute truth, which is really because if you think about it, even in our culture, if you take away this traumatic threat, like you're going to be tortured forever, I mean, basically, I think any sane person would worship anything as an alternative to eternal torture. I mean, what wouldn't you worship if you were actually faced with eternal torture? So, but if you take away this coercion, if you take away this theological bullying, and just tell people, as Krishna tells them in the Gita, that you get a result based on the moral quality of your actions. The result you get in Bhagavad-gita, in terms of in the material world, it doesn't depend on worshiping Krishna. He's not jealous. He's not a jealous God. Krishna says people in the mode of goodness get elevated to higher worlds, they're happy, they're wise, and they worship the demigods. So, so there's no coercion. It's not these like horrible threats. And if you take away the threat of hell, how many people would have chosen throughout history to belong to a particular religion if they hadn't have been faced with torture in this life, burning alive at the stake, and then more burning forever after this life? If you take away all these like demonically coercive threats and just tell people these are different conceptions of God, and so what sort of inspires you? What, in terms of the beauty, in terms of everything, in terms of the logic, that would be a level playing field. So that way you can have a spiritual science. And of course, last point I'll make, and then whatever, you can ask questions if you like, that obviously those of us who have stayed in Krishna consciousness, I mean, I've been doing this for, holy cow, I've been doing this for about 54 and a half years. It's amazing. It means I started with the moment I was born. But anyway, I've been doing this for 54 years, and it just keeps getting better and better. I'm a very satisfied customer. I put a good review on what, a TripAdvisor or something. So yeah, so I'm doing this because it's a science. It's a science for me because I see a precise correlation between what I do, good or bad, appropriate or inappropriate, and the results I get. There's a precise connection. So it is a spiritual science. There is causality. It just all makes sense. And therefore, I have a spiritual science. It's just like if you don't study, let's say, Newtonian physics, that won't be a science for you. You can take it on faith. Well, everybody says it is, so I guess it is, but it won't be a living, self-evident, experiential science for you. Nothing can really be a science for you unless it has a strong experiential element. You're just taking it on faith. Like we hear from the media that the Webb telescope discovered all these galaxies that are ridiculously far away from us. And so we take it on faith. I guess those galaxies really are that far away, although there's a very serious possibility based on the history of science that 100 years from now, they'll have a different idea about that. And I'm basing that just on the history of science. In fact, one of the proud claims of science is nothing we say is an absolute truth. It's all open to critique, improvement, new discoveries. They brag about that. So therefore, what do we really know about the material world? I don't know that you like apple pie, or that your GP takes you every day to your yoga class, GPS. So, but in terms of theoretical science, everything is open for refutation. It's an open system. It's not a closed system. Whereas in the case of Bhagavad-gita, we accept this as the absolute truth. And then we just advance in our realization of it. Anyway, so I'll stop there. But I think I've explained to you in various ways, the notion of a spiritual science. And so, any questions on these topics?
Yeah, thank you very much, Maharaj, for this wonderful deliberation. So, yeah, before I think we take up the questions, can I take 2 minutes to make some little announcement about a course?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Just I'll share my screen. Yeah. So, yeah, we have been talking about how spirituality, path of religiosity could be a science. So, in that discussion, you would be happy to know that we are launching a course called Art and Science of Practical Spirituality. So, it's a course that has 5 themes. We'll be discussing how science and spirituality could be integrated, particularly exploring the connection between rational inquiry and the transcendental knowledge that we find in spiritual domains. The second theme would be comparative knowledge systems. We'll analyze Indian Western epistemologies, the ontologies they define, and how the knowledge evolves over the centuries. So we'll discuss that. We'll also touch upon the ideas of notions of theism, atheism, and how its place in scientific thought. And also we'll touch upon some key issues in science, like consciousness, reincarnation, theory of karma, that forms the basis for Eastern philosophies. So, and also we'll talk about a very practical thing, dharma and ethical living. So, how practicing spirituality can be so harmonious. So, these are some of the key points that we'll be covering in this course. This course, yeah, these are the instructors. So this course is a 15 session course. It's starting from 9th of March, and the classes would happen on Sundays, 7:30 p.m. IST, uh, Indian Standard Time. And there would be, of course, this official certificate, because Institute for Science and Spirituality, it is a recognized Indian Knowledge Systems Research Center by Ministry of Education, Government of India. So yeah, these are the course details. You can browse to our webpage. I'll also paste the link, and you can register. And the last date for enrollment is 8th of March. So thank you. So now let's go back to the questions. Let's deliberate upon what Maharaj said. So it's really, really fascinating what you said, particularly drawing parallels between science and how the very notion of causality we can also trace in spiritual discussions, as you gave some examples. So it's really fascinating. But the problem becomes, the science talks about very measurable, quantifiable ontologies. I mean, at least it pretends that everything is measurable. So, but in spiritual,
But again, if you mean everything is physically measurable, fine. I mean, I appreciate real science. I mean, whether, especially applied science, of course.
yeah,
And I use it all the time. I mean, I'm using science right now. I don't want to bite the hand that gave me Zoom. And so the point is that, I'm grateful. I'm not ungrateful. Science is wonderful. What's not wonderful is cheating. Cheating's not wonderful unless it's Krishna stealing butter. So, for example, what's wrong is imperialism. For example, let's say you live in a country and it's a nice country. That's very good. We can appreciate it. Good government or whatever. Obviously, not talking about this country, America. But if you invade another country, that's not good. So we appreciate science. What I don't appreciate is pseudoscience. I mean, it is not a scientific statement to say that everything must be empirically proved, because that statement is not empirical. It's self-contradictory.
Right.
I appreciate science. Claiming that only science is objective is not science. That's not a scientific claim.
Right.
It is a fanatical claim about science, but it's not. So if you say only science, you can't say that because it contradicts itself. If you say only statements empirically proved should be claimed, or only empirical facts, but you just made a non-empirical, so you've contradicted yourself.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think we have a right in a debate to demand that the other person not just speak gibberish and nonsense.
Hmm.
If I say that, if I'm at a scientific conference and I say 2 + 2 is 4, and then I say, but 2 + 2 is also 7 and 9, I'm just speaking nonsense.
Yeah. True.
So we have to hold their feet to the fire, so to speak. I don't let them get away with this nonsense. I'm not intimidated by science. I'm impressed by science, but not intimidated. And I don't like phonies. I don't like phonies. I don't like people who, out of one side of their mouth saying it has to be empirical, and the other side of their mouth, they make this big claim that's not empirical. They're hypocrites
Yeah.
and philosophical fools. They may be great scientists, but philosophically, they're fools and hypocrites.
Yeah, in my own experience also, many of the scientist colleagues, I mean, they may be talking about a lot of science, but they're philosophically, practically illiterate. I mean,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
they don't know the very basic tenets of philosophy. I mean, so that's the irony. So that's the hypocrisy. Anyway, but we really do have some good science, but it pretends to be, in many cases, causally closed. I mean, they say we don't
But
need.
if you say, but if you say causally closed, that's not an empirical claim.
Yeah, certainly.
In other words, it's just hypocrisy. It's not science. The claim that the universe is causally closed is not a scientific claim. So
Yeah,
it's just contraband. They're trying to smuggle in religious views. It's like, it's like if you're bringing diamonds into a country and you put it in a box and the box says, I don't know, uh, you know, bathroom lotion or something. Or you just say it's underwear. When actually it's diamonds. So it's just contraband. It's smuggling. And we're going to stop them at the border.
yeah. And of course, that's not so easy.
Oh, it
Probably,
is. Well, it's not so easy if you
yeah,
have a job. If you have a job, and you'll get fired if you say it. But I mean, there's two criteria. If you say it's not easy in terms of the situation that I'm in, my job, and this, yeah, that's true. But if you're talking philosophy, it's the easiest thing in the world to
yeah,
show that they're fools.
yeah. Thank you so much. I think let's have some questions from the participants. I see a couple of questions. Those who have any questions, please paste it in the chat box. I'll take it up. So the first question by Supriya, she says, "Can science prove the existence of soul?" So, what's your view on that?
That's interesting. Who asked that question?
Supriya.
Sukriya, are you here? Can we see you?
Yeah, if you are there, you can also join. You can switch on our video. You can
Yeah, it's
speak.
nice to see the person that asked the question. Anyway,
Hello,
Sukriya.
hello, sir. Yeah, this is Supriya here. So I'm unable to like switch on my video now, but I'm audible. Am I audible?
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
please.
fine. Supriya. Okay. All right. So please, could you repeat your question?
Sir, that was an excellent lecture and it was very enlightening. So my question was, can science prove the existence of soul?
Hmm.
So yeah.
I think science can, in a sense, prove it by the via negativa. Via negativa, which just means the negative way, the negative path, is a philosophical principle going back to, forever, going back many, many centuries. The idea is that the negative path means you eliminate all the other possibilities
Hmm.
so that what's left becomes the prime candidate. So I think that science can show that if they were honest, they could show that, or they could admit that we cannot really show that states of consciousness are always caused by neurological brain states. Uh, because what they say, it's amazing how much they cheat. I mean, it's not everyone, but a lot of them, they'll say, yes, that, we've shown that, for example, if you're angry, you activate certain places in your brain, or if someone is, other emotional states or whatever. But they fall into the oldest trap in the world, which is confusing correlation with causation.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I turn on my lamp, the light goes on. So I could conclude that the little switch on the lamp creates electricity. When in fact, what's really happening is that electricity is something else. So another thing about this thing with neurology and mental states is that the more you go into what is considered higher states of consciousness, such as abstract reasoning or metaphysical reasoning, the more it's not possible to actually, even the correlation becomes very, very difficult.
Yes.
So therefore, science has not shown causation. I mean, obviously, let's say someone, let's say stimulates some part of your brain and that and that causes you to have, some pain or some pleasure or whatever. But those are not acts of free will.
Hmm.
What we're really talking about are, let's say, free states of consciousness or acts of free will or even general knowledge. I mean, if let's say you tie someone up and put a lot of heroin in the person, I mean, you're obviously going to affect their consciousness or destroy it. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about acts of free will, for one thing. I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be worked out with this, but so Supriya, do you understand those points?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That
Thank
Did you have any follow-up on that?
you. Supriya, do you
No,
have
no,
any?
no. I don't have any follow-up question. I'm quite convinced. Thank you.
Hare
Okay.
Krishna.
Thank you. So next question, maybe I can take it up. Natalie Black. I mean, I don't know how to pronounce it. So
Yeah, that's it, Natalie. Good
okay.
old.
So how can you prove that Krishna actually has all of those qualities? I mean, are you referring to what? Could you make it clear if you are
Yeah,
there?
yeah, I think I understand that. It's okay. That's actually you raised a very important topic that I didn't get around to, and that is, what does it mean to prove something spiritually that Krishna has all those qualities? And so, I would put that in a much more general philosophical articulation, which is that the empirical method, by its own methodology, and it can only study things over which we have some power. In other words, think of the controlled experiment. Obviously, you can't perform controlled experiments on things you can't control. And control includes access. Like, for example, take the Webb telescope again. Uh, they sent it out with the assumption, which turned out to be true, that at least certain aspects of the universe are just available to our inspection. But let's say, for example, you want to do a scientific study of the interior design of your neighbor's house, and your neighbor says, I don't want you to do that, and I won't allow you to come into my house. How are you going to do the study? So the empirical method depends on, logically requires control. And you can know it. And to the extent that you have control, that much, to that extent, you can do empirical science. For example, the Webb telescope could take pictures of these ridiculously far away galaxies. But if you say, well, I want to go in closer, let's go in closer to these galaxies and really, start to do some much more in-depth study. You can't do that. Why? Because you don't have the power to control it to that extent. Or let's say, for example, you're trying to study a person, and the person says, I will tell you some things about my life, but not other things. Or the person may change their mind. Again, even if you're studying just another being with free will, the empirical study you can do is very limited. It's limited by the amount of access which that person gives you. And there's another limit, and that is that, people have free will. So therefore psychology, that was Freud, crazy Sigmund, who taught that religion is a mental illness. Very pious. So Freud, his dream was to make psychology a hard science, like physics, like chemistry. And of course he failed. Why? Because chemicals don't have free will, for example. Therefore, you can have a hard science of chemistry, because it's not that if you put together, let's say, two atoms of hydrogen and one of H2O.
Yeah.
And
Two
one
hydrogen
of
and oxygen.
Yeah. But what if the oxygen just says, I'm not in the mood? The last time I went out with those hydrogen atoms, I had a terrible time, and they're really boring. I got home late, so no, I'm not going to combine with the oxygen or the hydrogen. Now, to the best of our knowledge, oxygen atoms, or let's say they don't have free will. So the whole science of chemistry and physics is based upon the assumption of the things you're studying not having free will. And if they do have free will, you are, sort of up the philosophical creek without a paddle. Because people can just say to you, I don't want to be interviewed, I don't want to be studied, and that's the end of your empirical science. So, not to speak of God, who has infinite free will. So, Hemakesh Muda. Hemakesh, isn't that golden hair?
Yes, it is. I'm surprised you knew that.
Yeah,
I
you
just
should go
wanted to
there.
say,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
just
please
wanted
go
to
ahead.
say, you said that how like hydrogen and oxygen atoms didn't have free will, right? Technically, at the quantum level, doesn't everything become so random that they almost as if it looked like they had free will?
It's very interesting. That you've raised a very important and an old issue in quantum physics. And actually, it's exactly on the point that you've raised that led Einstein to reject quantum physics as a mature science. And so when all the biggest quantum physicists met in Copenhagen, they came up with the Copenhagen Agreement, I think around about 100 years ago. And it's very interesting because they apparently gave up the principle of correspondence. And I'll explain what that means. Correspondence in science means that, for example, when Newton came up with his equations or his principles, everyone assumed that he's describing the real world, that there's a real force in nature called gravity, and there's another real force in nature called inertia. And if you combine gravity and inertia, in this case, not that something at rest will stay at rest, but something in motion will continue in motion. When you combine gravity and inertia, you get planetary orbits or other orbits. And so everyone believed that Newton is talking about the real world. And then when Einstein came up with his kind of, psychedelic stuff, then everyone again assumed that that's the way the real world is. If you had a God's eye view, that's the way the world is. With quantum physics, here's the problem. The equations work amazingly well. I've just compared two words, electron, electronics. So the quantum equations have turned out to be amazingly accurate for applied science. But even the quantum physicists admit that we are not describing the real physical world in the same way that Newton or Einstein did, or thought they were, or we thought they were. So we don't really know. For example, take spooky action at a distance in quantum physics, where if you have two bonded, I guess, subatomic particles, one positive, one negative, then if you change you change one of them, the other one just flips, and apparently it just happens simultaneously. It's not that, okay, it will take so long for that information to travel through space. No, apparently it's simultaneous. So, so where does that come from? So it's quantum physics, applied quantum physics is amazing. But quantum physics as a one-to-one description of what the physical world really is, no, it's not there. And so therefore, if we say that, so if we're talking about quantum physics, we can't assume we're describing the way the world really is.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
How did I know that? My God, I'm a humanities brat. I dabbled a little bit in this stuff. Didn't want to be completely ignorant of it. So
Oh yeah, please
One issue,
continue with what you were saying. Yeah.
yeah, please. Yeah, one issue related to free will is that he was referring is probably the sense of agency. So free will and agency, they're quite related, I feel. So I mean, the atoms and molecules, I don't think even though they follow some kind of randomness, they really have some kind of agency of themselves. So does that?
well, that's interesting because if molecules and atoms have agency, which means they're capable of choosing to do things,
Yeah.
there have to be souls there because dead matter. I mean, consider what Krishna says in Bhagavad-gita, where he says, Bhumirapo analovayu kangmano buddhireva cha ahankariti me bhinna prakriti rashtada. Earth, water, fire, air, ether, or space, actually. Mind, intelligence, false ego. Krishna calls it my bhinna prakriti, my separated energy. And then he says, aparayam, anyway, take out the sandhi, aparayam. This is inferior. Krishna describes the physical world and he says, this is inferior. He says, aparayam itas, but beyond this, aparayam itas twanyang prakriting vidhi me. Know that I have another energy or another prakriti. Prakriting vidhi me param, which is superior. This is inferior. The other one is superior. This is inferior. The other one's superior. Why? Why superior? Because it's jiva bhutam. It is a living being. So therefore, I mean, there is such a thing as dead matter. And so I don't think we can attribute intention, will, or consciousness to something which is dead. Because if something has consciousness or will, it's obviously not dead. It's like that hilarious scene in the Monty Python movie, The Holy Grail, during the plague where they're throwing someone into the barrel to be buried. He says, "No, I'm alive. I'm happy. I'm still alive." So yeah, so according to Krishna, we cannot attribute will, volition, intention to something which is dead.
Yes.
Although, if you think that consciousness is a byproduct or, I don't know, epiphenomenon of matter, then you can get into this silly, what do they call it? I forget the name they give it, where everything is conscious. It's some sort of, philosophy meant to avoid God.
Pantheism? No.
Yeah, or panpsychism, that's what they call it.
Panpsychism. Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of like, it's like when you're a kid, there's a game called Keep Away, where there's a ball and keep it away from one of the kids. So it's like this childish keep away, like no God, no soul, it's just matter itself is conscious,
Yeah.
which
In
I
that,
which I find to be meaningless and absurd.
yeah, it's true. In that line, there is a question by KP Saini. So he or she is asking, what is consciousness? How it can be defined?
Oh, that's okay. So let's go back to the dictionary.
Okay.
And the dictionaries, and words like this are always going to take you around this cycle of synonyms. That's all it's
Yes.
going to. So the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings. She failed to regain consciousness, the awareness or perception of something by a person. So I would say if you're conscious, you know you are, and you know what it means.
Hmm.
And so, in a sense, we can do an infinite regress of definitions of synonyms. We could say, well, it's awareness. Well, what's awareness? And then probably if you look up awareness, it'll probably take you back to consciousness. Let's see, because dictionaries tend to go in loops. Then awareness, knowledge or perception of a situation or fact. So yeah, it's just, I think it's sort of semantically basic. In other words, it's just like some things are just basic. They're basic definitions, and you can give synonyms, but you've reached sort of like the bedrock semantic level. So I would say consciousness is one of those things. And if you're conscious, you know you are. And it's not consciousness. It's not, for example, where you program, say, an electronic device to respond in certain ways. Because we have no reason to think that device is conscious. It's just physical cause and effect. Whereas, let's say the fact that I'm aware of all of you because I'm seeing your pictures, and I'm assuming that an evil genius didn't take over the world and is just making me think that you're all there.
Interesting. I mean, we cannot have a conscious meter like any other meter we have measuring.
Yeah, because it's not physical. So if you say, how do I know? For example, let's say this is KP Saini, right?
Yeah, KP Saini. Yeah.
So, for example, when you have some medical procedure, sometimes they put you under and you lose consciousness. And then when you come back to consciousness, I mean, you know it. It's like if I say to you, how do you know that the anesthesia wore off and you've actually come back? I mean, you obviously know it.
Hmm.
It's just, it's a, what they call in philosophy, properly basic. In other words, you can just do an infinite regress of definitions and synonyms, But at a certain point, you have to say, if you don't know what this word means, you just, unfortunately, you're not going to know what this word means.
Yeah, true. Uh, can we take up a few more questions? It's already 8:57. I mean, it's close to
Sure.
9 p.m.
Yeah,
IST.
make an offer I can't refuse.
Okay, maybe one last question. So somebody was asking about circular logic. So it's Gaurapriya. She's asking,
Oh, where's Gora Priya?
yeah, I don't see her. She sent me a private.
Okay. Yeah,
So
circular reasoning.
yes, she's asking, how can we argue that Krishna consciousness is a science? And we say that uh, based on the authority that Krishna has given this, so it's an issue of
Maybe
secret.
I would say maybe people that come from India, it's just like Christians that come from the West, or Buddhists that come from a Buddhist country. When you're born into something and you're taught by your parents, and your neighbors also believe that, it's you just sort of believe it. But like in my case, or in the case I think many other people that were not born into this tradition, I accepted it because I experienced it in a way which was irrefutably, self-evidently true. I don't want, we don't have time to get into the whole Aristotelian notion of self-evident and how Lord Chaitanya also taught this same thing, self-evident. In other words, certain experiences are so powerful, they just prove themselves to us, and therefore they stop an infinite regress of proofs.
Hmm.
And in epistemology and philosophy, that's called foundationalism. That something has to be the foundation of your views. And otherwise, you can just get into an infinite regress of proofs and synonyms and so on. And so, my experience of Krishna served as a properly basic epistemic foundation. It was so powerful, it was so real, that I would be grossly irrational to reject it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Professor Nandita how do you, Saikia?
Like,
Is
yeah,
that it?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Uh,
Professor Sakya, I could ask your question by unmuting.
Krishna Maharaj, a very enlightening talk. I want to know, I think, when there is an environment, matter can be transformed to spirit. For example,
oh, could you speak a little louder, a little louder?
louder.
Maybe turn up your volume.
Yes, Hare Krishna Maharaj, really enlightening talk. I had the question that can matter have consciousness? Because when my this question is because matter can be uh, transformed to life when there is a proper environment. Say a single seed, it is a matter, but when we do the process of germination, it becomes life. So my question is that whether matter can have consciousness.
Yes, very good question. Why am I hearing echo? Maybe I'm hearing on your device. Okay. So the answer is no. However, matter, like the example that you gave, matter can become suitable to house life. So what we find is in the, bioenvironment is that wherever there's a hospitable environment for life, life tends to go there. So in a laboratory, you can create circumstances that attract life or that facilitate life, then life will enter that. And so matter can be, and I'm using the word in a special philosophical way, matter can be enlivened. I don't mean that you get enthusiastic matter that's bouncing on your laboratory table, but I mean it can be enlivened in the sense that it can become, that life can enter it. It's just like, take mannequins. You go to a store and they have all these mannequins. And of course, they're not supposed to be all beautiful or, the proper weight anymore, because that's body shaming other people. But anyway, let's say you go into a store and they have these mannequins that are dressed in certain ways But the clothes they're wearing are never alive. If you buy the clothes and put on the clothes, then you are living. Like let's say you take some clothes which are still in, good condition or even new, and just put them on the street. Someone's going to take it and put it on. And so, in the same way, if you create in a laboratory or anywhere else conditions that support life, then life will enter that. But the matter itself is not alive. It's just become a suitable environment to host life. So, is that clear?
Yes. Thank you, Maharaj.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah. So maybe one more last question, if you don't mind. It's somebody's asking, what is spirituality, and how can it help us to identify ourselves, find our own
So,
identity?
identifying yourself is spirituality. It is the process of, it's self-identification, self-realization. So basically, let's say I am a human being born in Los Angeles, California, but I think I'm a frog in Afghanistan. God, I don't think I'd even want to be a frog in Afghanistan. But anyway, so let's say I think I'm a frog in Afghanistan, then it's sanity would help me to identify where I really am from. So it's just a question of being sane and being accurate and objective. So spirituality doesn't mean just to go and, go to a temple and sing a song. Although that's also nice if you sing the right song. But spirituality means to just be sane, because we are spirit. It's just sanity. It's accuracy. It's just getting things right.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So thank you very much, Maharaj, for such enlightening discussion. It's almost more than 1.5 hour. So
Okay, so maybe we'll end here. Thank you all for coming. It would have been a little disappointing if no one showed up, but
no more than 100 joined, so it's really wonderful. They all must have benefited from this wonderful talk. So we'll post this recording on our YouTube and other platforms, and somebody who hasn't yet watched, so they can watch it later also in detail once again also. So it's really wonderful. It's always a pleasure to have you, Maharaj, on our platform to discuss on this interesting issues. So we look forward to your future appearances on our this platform to discuss more on this philosophy and different religious topics. So thank you so much for
thank
taking.
you. Yeah, thank you especially, and my
Thank you.
thanks.
When is the next Zoom meeting, Maharaj? When is the next Zoom meeting?
To be announced. We'll let
Oh,
Leslie know.
thank you. I love this session. I love this.
Hare
Yeah,
Krishna.
we'll try to do it as frequently as possible,
Every
but we
Sunday,
really
every Sunday.
every week is difficult, but
I am ready for every Sunday.
okay, so let's see. Hopefully, we are planning to have at least one meeting in every 2 weeks.
Great.
So we'll invite different speakers, of course, including Maharaj for subsequent discussions. So you join our group, the WhatsApp groups, other channels. We'll keep you posted with all these updates. Yeah, one last thing. Those of you who want to register for this course, I just posted on the chat box, Art and Science of Practical Spirituality. Please do that, and you'll be having a very fascinating journey of learning how science and spirituality talk to each other. Yeah. Thank you once again, everyone, for participating in this fascinating, fabulous discussion. Thank you,
Well,
Maharaj,
one
for
one
being here.
small point, Prabhu. Did you also mention the duration of the courses in the group?
Oh
Time.
yeah, the website, if you browse, you'll see that the duration is 15 weeks, at
Okay.
least 14 to 15 weeks.
Done.
And that would happen on Sundays, 7:30 p.m. India time. So the duration, every session would be around 1 hour to 1.5 hours. Yeah. So the detail, the course structure, everything given on the website. You can look into that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Maharaj, for being here. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hare Bol.
Krishna.